Welcome back to another episode of the Braun Performance and Rehab Podcast. Joining me today is Dr. Jeff Buxton from Grove City College. Jeff and I dive into the latest research that him and his team at Grove City have been working on, ranging from quadrupedal movement to nutrition and athletes, and so much more. This is a really great discussion. Jeff and I try to have one of these every year because they're doing such great work out there. Highly recommend you check him and everyone else at Grove City College out if you haven't already. They're doing amazing work out there. Episodes like this are made possible by our sponsors, ISOFIT and Oro Muscles. For more on ISOFIT and Oro, you can check the description below. Enjoy. Jeff, welcome back to the podcast. I want to say this is your third or fourth time coming on over the past 3 years or so. It's great to have you back, man.
Great to be here, Dan. Yeah, I think you're right. It's either third or it might be my third solo. I think I did 2 solo before and then 1 with Dr. Prince. So I think you're right.
You and Dr. Prince and that team you've assembled down there at Grove City in small town Pennsylvania, for lack of a better way to put it.
Yeah.
You know, it might be a small college, but you guys are always putting out big research and making huge contributions in the scientific sports science community that way. So I'm always interested to chat with you guys. But, you know, for people who might not be familiar with Grove City or the work that you've done that way, would you mind catching them up real quick about who you are, where you're at, and all that you do?
Yeah, Grove City College. We're, as you said, a small town school, liberal arts college in Western Pennsylvania, about an hour from everything in Western PA. And yeah, we have an undergraduate research program here at Grove City College. As you said, we do a lot of research and we get to include a lot of our students in some of that research. Hopefully we'll share some of the stuff that they did here in this time that we have. I'm going to plug our master's program real quick here. Got to do that. We just got approved to offer a master's program. So we're actually recruiting for that now. So we're looking to start our first cohort this upcoming spring, where you could continue to do some cool research with us if you wanted to. But yeah, so I've been at Grove City now for, oh my gosh, probably 10 or so years. And I am a professor of exercise science. And my background is really sport and human performance, and that's my passion. And I've dabbled in all sorts of research. I'm kind of a jack of all trades. I'm from a nutrition side and performance. A lot of that work's been with Dr. Prinz, who's been heading that, and then some of my own work where I've been looking at some of the effects of quadrupedal based movement training. That's what I've been passionate about the last several years here. So yeah, hopefully that brings them up to date.
First off, I just got to give a huge shout out to Megan Rohde, because I don't know if she knew what she was getting into when she connected us 3-4 years ago, Jeff. But it's certainly amazing to see how much you guys have put out and how much you guys have contributed over the past several years that way. I really don't think you guys are slowing down, and I really don't know when you sleep. Second off, you know, it's funny because you brought up, as you mentioned, you've done a lot of research on the ketogenic side of things with Dr. Prinz and various nutritional impact on performance. You brought up the quadrupedal movement side of things there with animal flow. And I think that's something every time you've been on, there's been something new in relation to the work that you're doing with animal flow. And I feel like every time that we talk, I've heard more about it from other people. There's something about this, I guess, primitive way of moving, for lack of a better way to put it, that seems to have a lot of power and potential that it seems like we really haven't fully understood for quite some time.
Yeah, and it's something that I think we take for granted, and maybe movements that maybe we used to do, used to in quotations, you know, listeners, you can fill in what you want to fill in with used to do. But obviously, you, Dan, with your background, I'm sure you understand proprioception and neural language. Man, your hands are rich with sensors, and you put them in contact with the ground and it lights them up. And you put them in contact with the ground in such a way that now you're moving in this kind of quasi closed chain environment. And it's a whole rich set of signals that we definitely don't understand fully what's going on there mechanistically. Yeah, and this animal flow and quadrupedal movement training in general, again, like you said, there's a lot to it and there's some mystique to it, but it's basic movement training. It's exploring large ranges of motion under your own volitional control with the influence of gravity. And I just feel like it's putting us in unique movement situations that not only does a lot for our muscular system, which was really the aim that I was looking at for this third study that I've completed, was looking at the muscular demands. But as my second study showed, it has significant impact with the cardiorespiratory system, and the first study showed how it can influence range of motion, proprioception, as well as dynamic functional movement skills. So there's a lot of boxes that Animal Flow continues to, and quadrupedal movement training continues to check off.
Yeah, definitely. And you touched on so many amazing points there, Jeff. I mean, on the proprioceptive side of things, you're right. The hands are very rich in nerve endings. And I'll even mention the feet as well have a ton of
Yeah,
nerve endings. And a lot of people train in ways where we never really appreciate the contact that they have with the ground or at various surfaces that way. And I think that there's so much power and potential to, for lack of a better way to put it, unlocking the nervous system and how we move. I find a
yeah,
lot of times people that I work with from a PT side, they're not weak or tight from a physical standpoint in the way we often think about it. It's more of a neural tightness or a neural weakness. And what I mean by that
yeah,
is
I agree.
they have this lack of strength in certain positions. So their body seems to guard up and prevent them from moving into those ranges. So they perceive it as tightness when in reality, they just have never taught their body how to stabilize at that range, at that position. So I perceive that as more of like a neural mechanism driven tightness. It's like, brute strength, if we tested them, they're going to be fine. But if we
Right.
change our angle, we change our position to that, selected area, there's a significant amount of weakness there. So it's one of those things that I think the more we kind of dive into understanding that neural driven approach, the more we can certainly make changes from a performance standpoint. And it's interesting. I had a girl earlier today that I worked with, actually, late stage ACL. And one of the things that I've given her to work on at home, and I knew she was going to say something when she read it, and she did. But I gave her different rolling patterns to work on at
Oh
home
yeah.
for three
Yeah.
to 5 minutes.
Yeah.
And she was like, why the heck am I doing this? Like just rolling on the ground from this position to that position. And it's something that I've given a number of lacrosse athletes. It seems to be like this light bulb moment for them once they get into a game and get knocked down to the ground. It's like, oh, wow, I've actually trained for
I've been
this.
here. I've been here before.
Yeah, we've been here before. But it's something that we often miss in our training programs. And it's like those kind of, movements, if we're not prepared to do them, can certainly very easily result in injury, right? You get knocked down to the ground, you roll to the ground. That's
Yeah.
a very easy mechanism for something in the knee to go. But if we've
Yep.
constantly trained our ability to interact with the ground, get down
Yep.
to the ground and get up from the ground through various flow type patterns and positions, I think there's a lot of value in that.
Yeah, I agree. And a couple of things that I'll try to comment on. I think it's super important for coaches and therapists, just as you're doing, Dan, to be thinking about kind of training for that worst case scenario. It's easy to put them in the common patterns that we would test people in. But if we're not looking at the uncommon, if we're not looking at that, that worst case scenario, and they haven't been there, they're going to have a hard time there. So, look for those moments. This was one of the influences of a study we did several years ago where we looked at conditioning for the lateral ankle. And what we looked at was kind of common therapeutic and rehabilitatory practices to strengthen the lateral ankle in a way that maybe this would prevent injury. And then we compared that to, well, what does the actual injury pattern look like? And it's that, that inversion. Forgive me if I get that wrong. Inversion, eversion. I always mess that up, and I tell my students that. But we looked at, what does that really look like? What does the body look like? And so we actually started training a kind of a closed chain version of what the ankle sprain I guess pattern would look like. And it's this idea that, hey, let's show them or train them in that worst case scenario. And if we do it progressively with the right patterning initially, and then we can get to some more aggressive patterns. Hopefully, this would be something that when their body sees it in real time, they go, "Oh, I've been here. I'm okay." Something else, going back to what you were saying though, Dan, about animal flow and getting on the ground and lighting up stuff. It's interesting. What I feel seems to be magical, novel movement. Even your rolling pattern for this lacrosse girl, that's a novel movement pattern for her. Even though she used to do that when she was, a couple of weeks, maybe not a couple of weeks, a couple of months old, she would roll, right? But then we stopped doing this. We stopped getting to the ground and rolling. When we introduce a novel movement, I feel like it's that novel movement that unlocks so many other things, so much potential in human performance. I think what it does is it unlocks this neuroplasticity and more so this neuromuscular plasticity. I'll kind of leave that there for you to chew on, but novel movement, I think, has some benefit, and animal flow definitely checks that box of introducing novel ways of moving our body. We feel real clunky when we first start doing it. These types of movements, whether it's animal flow, quadrupedal movement training, getting on the ground, rolling, even some of the functional movements, I hate to use that word functional because it's so cliched, who knows what it really means. Non-traditional, right? Your non-traditional types of ways of moving, these help to like fill in gaps, help to fill in neuromuscular gaps that more traditional training doesn't address. And yeah, like you mentioned, you might test someone on a standard strength test and they'll score off the charts, or they'll be right where they need to be, but they're still injured or they're still seeing some movement deficit, right? And this is where some of this unique type of training can help fill gaps and fill in those spots that are missing.
Exactly. And, at the end of the day, it comes back to the phrase, the body always sacrifices quality of movement for quantity of movement, right? So the
Yeah.
body is always going to try and solve whatever movement problem you, pose it to, basically. And
Yes.
I think that the more you expand that vocabulary of movements that you have access to, the more problems you're going to be able to effectively solve. Hopefully without running into injury that way. And you're right, it is novel. It is always interesting to people when we throw one of these, more unique patterns at them and they're like, wow, this is really hard. From a motor development standpoint, even something as simple as crawling on the
Yes.
floor,
Yeah.
at one point, everyone is able to crawl pretty much all day long. And nowadays, I put people in a crawling position and they go like 30-second bear crawl and they're looking at me like, why is this so hard? Like,
Quads are
why?
screaming,
Yeah, why
wrists
am I
are
struggling?
screaming.
Yeah.
Right.
And it's like, this is something that you could once do, standard practice without even thinking about it. So it's
Yeah.
almost this concept of rewilding ourselves. And this is where I think animal comes in the term animal flow, right? Like, getting back to more of a primitive movement pattern standpoint and less of a fixed rigid model. And I think the more that we break out of the box or the mold, the better people will move as a result, or at least that tends to be what I see
Yeah.
clinically that way. And I know in the past, I think one of our episodes you referenced a study that looked at abdominal activation, core muscular activity in an
Mhm.
animal flow pattern. I forget if that was one of your studies
No,
that
that
you
was from
did.
no, that's from Pica. I can't remember their first name, Pica et al.
Yeah, and it was incredible to see just how much core
Yeah.
activation we got when we weren't doing any, quote unquote direct core training exercise, so to speak.
Dan, that's really cool. That I'll kind of share some. Again, this is non-peer reviewed
Yeah, go
uh,
for it.
in the process, but this is exactly what we looked at. We sought to expand on that study that Pica did. I think it was back in 2017-ish. And we wanted to look more at, okay, well, what happens? They gave us a good look at what happens with some of the trunk musculature. And that was only during three, I guess you could call animal flow movements. One was kind of a static 4-point beast hold. The other was a alternating limb lift from that static beast hold. And then the third pattern that they looked at was the crawling, the forward traveling beast. That was cool. Obviously, that beast position, that 4-point position, is a very common pattern in quadrupedal movement training. But in the animal flow system and other systems that utilize quadrupedal movement training, that only represents a handful of the movement options that are there to you. So for our study, what we wanted to do is we wanted to look at a, a handful of the animal flow level 1 movements, and we wanted to look at more of a full body muscle activation representation. And then the idea was, let's compare that to more commonly used traditional body weight exercises. So we chose 8 animal flow exercises that we felt kind of best encompassed the general movements of all of the movements that you could do in animal flow. There's a lot, but they captured the essence of most of those movements, right? So it was a good representation of the system. That's really what we were trying to get at. And then we compared the muscle activations of the bicep, the medial deltoid, the tricep, the pec major, the latissimus dorsi. We had the rectus abdominis, so that was common with pica study. And then we looked at the rectus femoris and the bicep femoris on the lower extremities. And we compare that to what's happening in a basic push-up, a forearm plank, and then a basic body weight squat. So kind of just traditional body weight exercises. The findings were really fascinating. And I guess, again, non-peer-reviewed data, the paper, the manuscript's in the review process right now. But we found that in most cases, we saw a higher muscle activation or a comparable muscle activation with animal flow to the more traditional body weight exercises. And when I say higher muscle activation, what I'm looking at there is the pooled. So if we pooled all 8 of the animal flow movements, and we looked at, okay, what was the average bicep activation across all 8 animal flow exercises? If we're looking at that number and then comparing it to what's happening in the push-up or in a forearm plank or in a squat, that's what I'm talking about. Individually, when we analyzed each animal flow movement individually, the muscle activations, and again, depending on upper body, lower body, or core, were generally higher with all the animal flow exercises than the traditional exercises, except for one, and that would be the push-up was superior at activating the pectoralis major than any other animal flow movement that we looked at. So across the board, we're seeing a superiority or a comparability, with your animal flow movements to traditional body weight exercises. Now, again, EMG, it's not the end all be all of what's happening during an exercise, but it still gives us some clues of what's going on.
What do you think that is, Jeff, from a mechanism standpoint? I mean, my first thought is, as we mentioned, this is a very new movement pattern. We're ending up in new positions. So I almost kind of picture the body going haywire, for lack of a better way to put it, trying to figure out, how do I stabilize in this position? What do I do?
Yeah.
And that's kind of my proposed mechanism of like, hey, we haven't been here before. We have to figure out how to, build stability here. So we're just going to light up everything.
Yeah, so I think what we're seeing, Dan, is the actual representation of what's going on with the body. The neat thing about animal flow and several other quadrupedal movements, but a lot of the movements that are used in animal flow, generally you're starting in a movement will begin in a solid base, such as that 4-point beast position. But then there's a transition, and oftentimes in those animal flow movements, you're transitioning to 3 limbs for support, 2 limbs for support. In some cases, you might, or in some instances, you might be in a single limb for support in a quadrupedal position. And I think it's that transitioning where we see the reduced base of support, as well as that reduced base of support kind of interacting with whatever body shape or body position you're in, that's eliciting these high, peak muscle activations. Without, putting the electrodes on you, we would kind of maybe just take for granted.
No, I think that's an interesting point, because you're right. On one hand, it's like, do we even fully understand or appreciate the muscular activation that's going on that we can't see? Like, obviously, if I put someone in a isometric type position, I can usually get some pretty good muscular shaking responses from them. But
Yes.
what muscle is actually contributing to that, and at what level? because
Hmm.
I think a majority of the time it's not what we think it is. I'll give you an
Yeah,
example. I was reading a paper recently. I can't remember the author of it right off the top of my head, but there was a paper I was reading recently looking at the Nordic hamstring curl. Super
sure.
popular exercise. They showed EMG data that suggested the gracilis is one of the primary muscles contributing to the Nordic hamstring curl. And it's like, that's not what we normally
No,
think
right,
of when we think hamstring curl.
right.
It's like, maybe there's more to this than we think. And maybe instead of taking things for face value, we actually have to dig in a little bit deeper and ask some more questions like, why is this happening or what's actually happening? Because
Yeah.
there's a lot more going on under the surface than we really think, and then more than we can really appreciate, I think.
I think that's a incredible point, and man, I would love for anybody in that muscle anatomy world to hear that. Our muscles do a lot more than just what your classic text says. The undergraduate level classic muscle anatomy, they do a lot more than that single plane of motion action. And I think hopefully our study here will help to highlight is that, like, oh my gosh, your bicep is doing a ton of cool stuff while you're doing this side kick through. Like, did you know that during a side kick through, you're training your bicep muscle, right? What we think about for a bicep is your classic, dumbbell curls. Not to pick on the biceps, but that's an easy one. Where we're not even flexing the elbow, but we're getting high to very high. And I'll add some, I guess, classification to that in the EMG text. When we say high level of muscle activation, that's anywhere from 41 to 60% of the maximal voluntary isometric contraction. The activity that occurred at a max contraction. High refers to 41 to 60% of that. And then very high means anything greater than 60% of that maximal voluntary muscle activation level. So we'll see in a side kick through, we'll see high to very high levels of bicep, deltoid, and even in the side kick through, some pec activation, but we're not even flexing the elbow, right? Which
Right.
that's more in line with your bicep, right? It's like, man, we're not even flexing the elbow, and we're getting huge amounts of bicep activation. So, anyways, just an example, right? To say that our muscles are doing a lot more than what we think they might be doing.
Yeah, no, that's such a great point. And I think that the more we think about that and kind of, moving to train program or train movement patterns instead of training isolated muscles, if that makes sense, becomes a main point of conversation here, right? Like you mentioned bicep curls, and it's like,
Yeah.
I can't even begin to tell you how often I see an athlete's program and it's like, okay, we're going to do bicep curls. And it's like, okay, decent movement, might
Right.
not have the best carryover to the demands of sport. I make the argument quite a bit that I think arm form is absolutely essential for athletes, especially athletes where contact occurs, field hockey, lacrosse, that sort of thing. It's like, hey, if I take a lacrosse ball to the elbow, for example, I'd like to have a little meat on the bone to kind of offset that. So I
Yes.
think there's a time and a place for it, but there's other ways to do that besides just straight bicep curls, right? Like, weighted chin up is going to hit way more muscles overall and allow you to load tissue more than a,
Yeah.
isolated bicep curl. But as you're mentioning, maybe we can get a lot of our, arm training or accessory training out of the way in some of these movement variability type of situations. And I think these sort of things actually become a great warm up and cool down addition
Yeah.
as well. The way my head works, because I kind of switch back and forth between what I'll call movement vocabulary / movement IQ and isometric work. We do a ton of ISOs, and I would
Hmm.
put both in your warm up and both in your cool down. Explore movement for 5 minutes, just move in different patterns, different positions, and then follow that with overcoming isometric loading to
Oh,
kind
so
of like
cool.
reinforce
Yeah.
or just turn your movement flow into an ISO. Get into a unique position and then hold it for 30 to 45
You want to
seconds.
see someone shake like a leaf? Do what you just said.
Right?
Absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah. So, no, Dan, and a couple of things there. Number one, we know nothing exists in isolation, but I would say that a lot of our traditional exercises are going to be much better at targeting certain tissues, and we can't neglect that. Like a bicep curl is phenomenal at targeting the bicep and the form, the elbow flexors. And we know that there's other muscles that are working depending on the version of bicep curl that you're doing. A lot of them are going to be working more as what we might call quote unquote stabilizers in that pattern. And that's good. But what we're seeing here, and a story that I think hopefully this paper is going to tell is here's some dynamic movements that elicit high to very high muscle activations, such that they're worthy of being able to say, hey, yeah, that will train that tissue well. But they also target a lot of other tissues dynamically all at the same time. So you get a lot more bang for your buck with some of these more dynamic movements, again, animal flow type movements here. You get a lot more bang for your buck with these than you would with maybe more of your traditional exercises that tend to be more, again, for the lack of a better word, isolated in its approach.
No, I think that's a good point, and it's one of those things too where everyone these days is everyone's on a time crunch with their training.
Everyone
So
is.
it's a matter of how can we get as much benefit as possible in the shortest amount of time. And I certainly think that this is a possible way to do that. Now, the
Yeah.
other thing, I know we talk a lot about training, but obviously you have to fuel that training as well. And I know you
Yeah.
guys typically have done research looking at ketogenic and higher fat diet approaches to
Yes,
fueling
sir.
for athletes, which I always really appreciate because it's kind of again, against the grain way of thinking, right? A lot of people think, oh my gosh, I have to be crushing carbs, I have to be crushing sugars in order to fuel myself for these events. When in reality, it seems we've been finding that that's not necessarily the case. And I know a while ago, we were talking about it earlier, actually. You guys got connected with past podcast guest here, Zach Schreier,
Oh,
and
yeah.
you were doing some work there. I'm
Mhm.
curious, what kind of work did you guys end up doing with Zach's company, and where are you at in that research process right now?
Yeah. So, yeah, we got hooked up with Zach. Thank you. So for LifeStacks is a nootropic coffee creamer. I believe is currently sold in a powdered form, and it is a really, really neat product. They have a couple of cool flavors. For our study, we used the chocolate flavor. That was more out of a necessity to easily match it with a placebo. That word nootropic is an interesting word, Dan. I'm sure you've heard that before, and
Oh, yes.
yeah, I think it's one of those. It's kind of like functional training. It's what does that really mean? And do we really know what we're talking about? I guess nootropic, and for the aficionados, forgive me if I totally go off the wrong end with this, but it refers to a substance that is ingested that will, to some degree, help to boost or improve cognitive function, whatever you're measuring there, right? There's so many different measures of cognitive function. So this product, LifeStacks, is littered with several nootropics. And what we found through our literature review and kind of our preparation for this study was that there is a lot of evidence out there for these chemicals and these molecules. A lot of them are the research is looking at a certain compound in isolation. That's great, and there's a lot of good evidence to show that all of these compounds that are out there that they have impacts on acute cognitive function. LifeStacks is a combination of several of these compounds that Zach and his team has identified and then been able to procure into this great tasting supplement that also includes some MCTs. So that I gotta mention that there was some MCT in this product. Anyway, so what we wanted to do was let's take this. This would be a neat way to look at multi-ingredient nootropics, and that was really our approach. Was we were curious about this multi-ingredient. I think that's been less studied in the literature. There's a handful out there, so we were using this more as a multi-ingredient look at this nootropic effect. And so our team took Zach's supplement and we paired it with a placebo, a flavor color matched placebo. I believe it was Coffee Mate was the one who passed the final test. basically what we did was we did some baseline testings. We did the ANAM, Stroop, and switching task. I'm sure some of the listeners are familiar with that. These are simple tasks where switching task. You'll look at a mannequin, and this mannequin is holding a ball in his right hand or his left hand, and you have to decide whether he's holding it in the left hand or the right hand and press a key. But the mannequin switches all around, right? He's upside down, he's facing forward, facing backward. System is going to register how quickly and how accurately you were with your response each time the mannequin is presented to you. And then that switches, this is why they call it a switching task, to some simple arithmetic tasks that you'll do. So you'll go through this battery of tests, and again, the system is looking for accuracy and response time. And then there's the Stroop task, which is a kind of a word color association test. If the word on the screen reads red, but the color of the letters is blue, you have to say it's blue, and there's be a set of keys that you have to press to correspond accurately. And again, we're looking for accuracy and response time. So we did some baseline testing of that, and then we used a really neat product called the FitLight. FitLight is a series of like hockey puck shaped and size discs that can be velcroed and placed on walls or cones, and they work off of an app that basically creates like this really sophisticated game of Simon Says. The pucks have a light emitting diode on them, and they light up all different colors. They have a proximity sensor, so you don't even have to touch them to disengage the light. And there's a main hub that again records reaction time and response time, as well as accuracy. So what we did was we used the Stroop and switching task as a sort of, this is our cognitive battery. And then we use the FitLight test as more of our physical reaction time test, because you actually had to press the lights as they lit up to turn them off and on in the random order that they came in on. So we did our baseline testing, and then subjects were presented with a standard cup of coffee. I can't remember exactly how many milliliters, but this was just regular Folgers coffee. And they either had one serving size of the placebo or one serving size of the LifeStacks creamer mixed in it. They drank their coffee. 60 minutes later, we retested them on those tests there. Again, all of this data is preliminary data, right? We're non-peer reviewed. Subject size was small, so listeners keep that in mind. We're at just a small sample size of 12 subjects. So you can consider this more of like pilot data. For the most part, we found no difference between the LifeStacks creamer and the placebo for all conditions, except for, this was interesting, except for the FitLight task, where they had to do the kind of sophisticated Simon Says task. And we found sort of what we're considering a protective effect for the non-dominant hand. In the placebo condition, the non-dominant hand actually got worse from pre-test to post-test. But in the LifeStacks condition, it was consistent with all of the other scenarios where non-dominant hand got better pre-test to post-test. So it was interesting. We looked at that as more of this kind of protective effect against the potential fatigue or mental fatigue that was occurring, and the LifeStacks kind of helped protect the non-dominant hand in that physical task there. So interesting findings, right? Something that warrants further investigation, bigger sample size.
First off, you talked about nootropics and MCT and so on that way. And I think a lot of people, they hear that and they go, wow, there's a lot to that. And there definitely is. And, nootropics and MCT could probably be its own podcast episode to a certain extent. But, in general, I also like the fact that from a study design standpoint, you used caffeine in both the placebo and the experimental, because I know someone would have looked at that and said, well, caffeine alone could have been the driving force. Caffeine alone could have caused that, not all the other stuff. So I like how you accounted for that. As far as the actual change in the light reactive drill, though, I think that is hugely important in the human performance world, because I think we're starting to see from a literature standpoint how important reactivity actually is to injury. I
Oh
think,
yeah,
when we think about change direction and agility, the way we train it is often in isolation, and the stimulus, the direction you're going to be changing to, and so on that way. When in reality, from a game time performance or game speed or whatever you want to call it, the real, measure is you don't always know where you're going to be going. You
right.
have to be able to react to various stimuli, whether that's, space that opens up on the field, your teammates, the opponents, where the ball is. Like, it's a lot more reactive based. It's very more chaotic of an environment. So if we see performance typically decline in that with fatigue, and now we have a supplement that seems to show some kind of protective or beneficial effects against that reactivity fatigue, I could certainly see a application there from a human performance standpoint on the importance of reactivity and that sort of thing.
Yeah, I agree. Yeah. No, it was neat finding, Dan. And yeah, that's a neat way to think about that. Right. We had pretty much no difference from a cognitive standpoint, but your physical reaction, yeah, we had this interesting protective effect that occurred.
I think that's one of the more important pieces as well is, it's not always about what we see at the underlying level. It's sometimes about what can we do with it, because
Right.
that seems to
Yeah.
be what people are really interested in anymore, is like, okay, what can I apply this to? Or what kind of things can I physically do from this? Not necessarily just, isolated improvements like that.
Yeah. No, for sure. We were talking this sports performance and nutrition and wanted to share with you that we're continuing to do some research with high fat energy bars and we're moving
Keto
along
brick,
there.
keto brick,
Keto
right?
brick, good old keto brick. Yeah, so it's standing the test of time. And like you were saying, what we're finding in our lab is that old dogma of I need carbs for performance. It's not holding up. So yeah, so we've had keto brick 2.0. Um, that study is in review. That study we looked at consuming either a keto brick or a isocaloric high carb bar 3 hours prior to running a 5K. So this contrasts, our first study looked at that same design, but with a much kind of lower intensity aerobic effort where they were basically doing a ruck 30 to 90 minutes. Sometimes people were going. So a little bit lower intensity, lower ruck. Here we're doing a 5K, not a sprint, but a little bit of a higher intensity kind of aerobic, anaerobic effort. Non-peer review data. I'm not actually going to share data with you. I don't want to bore the listeners with data points, but the basic finding was no difference. No difference whether they consumed the high carb bar versus the high fat bar. This higher intensity type of effort where again, generally, the idea is we need the carbohydrate fuel to support that. And the other neat thing with that study, we're seeing this across all of the studies that we've done, even with some of the preliminary data. And I say preliminary for the third study because we're still finishing data collection on that. But again, we're seeing no difference in performance, but we're also seeing a difference though in the substrate utilization. So obviously when the individual consumes the high carb bar, carbohydrates are burned at a much higher rate. But when they consume the high fat bar, we're seeing much higher rates of fat oxidation. So it's neat. We're showing that there can be some metabolic flexibility. And again, from a performance standpoint, there's no difference.
Which I absolutely love. First off, no performance difference regardless of fueling source yet.
Yeah,
In my mind, I think that, consuming 1,000 calories worth of keto bar in this case, but you can kind of swap that in your mind with
sure.
anything else high protein, high fat, low carb is
Absolutely.
probably a little bit more healthy on the system than 1,000 calories of sugar and carbs, just from an overall health standpoint. But from a fueling and performance standpoint, that's something that I think we're always struggling with across the spectrum with any sports team, any athletics team, not just endurance athletes, but even to a certain extent your field sports, right? Like lacrosse or field
Yeah,
hockey. A lot of these sports never really have an off season. In fact, a lot of my high school lacrosse athletes will come in and tell me how they played 5 or 6 games in a single tournament over the weekend, and that's
right.
3 or 4 a day. So
Right.
there's, an endurance element to that, I want to say. And if you're not fueling properly for it, you're obviously putting performance, on the back burner at that point if you're not able to provide, right? Like you're going to hit a point where you're pretty much catabolic and breaking down tissue in order to, continue to stay afloat. And I think that there's a lot of potential value for, as you said, that higher fat approach and shifting, energy utilization to more of that fat dominant approach than constantly being relying on that carb dominant approach, because we know that athletes almost never, ingest enough carbohydrate to fuel the amount of activity that they're doing at events like this. So if we can do something high calorie, high fat that will sustain us for a long period of time, and we're shifting our substrate utilization more towards a fatty standpoint, right? I think everyone has, some level of body fat that way. So when we do get in that catabolic state, if our body is, using more of a fat fuel source instead of breaking down muscular tissue, or breaking down more fat instead of muscular tissue, I think that's a trade that every athlete is willing to make and would benefit them from a performance standpoint and overall that way.
I agree. And I think just overall, Dan, it does suggest, and it maybe to a broader point that you were getting at, that we definitely have options from a performance fueling standpoint, that we don't have to feel pigeonholed. I, you know, yes, I agree with you that bar none, consuming less carbohydrates overall tends to probably be a healthier approach. I could put a lot of asterisks behind that comment, right? Because we could be looking at the quality of the carbohydrate. It's not to say that carbs are the enemy or the devil. But let's face it, a lot of the processed stuff that is carbohydrate dense and rich in our food system, it's garbage. And a lot of the stuff that is being promoted as sports performance fuel is garbage, right? And it's just perpetuating diabetes, you heart disease, you name it. It's just perpetuating it. So we have options. We don't have to feel from a performance standpoint that we have to be stuck with these, maybe less than desirable or less healthy choices that are out there.
You're right. There's plenty of options, and you're right too. It's so funny when you look at the ingredients label and the nutrition facts on some of these products, and you look at it, and it's like, how is this being promoted as something that is healthy?
It's
And don't get me
twisted.
wrong, like there are times and places to incorporate some of these different things in, right? Like, we've had a few different bodybuilders on the podcast, and I know that after their shows, they go and crush cupcakes and ice cream and all that sort of thing. But that's an extreme example, right? Like
Yeah.
that's not the norm for them and that sort of thing. So
No.
there's a time and a place for everything. It's just a matter of, do we really want to be constantly relying on garbage fuel source? And I think the short answer is no. The higher quality we can put in, the better performance we're going to see on the output side. I think that that whole concept of the body as a race car, so to speak, is becoming very cliche, but it holds true at the end of the day. If you put good fuel in, you should hopefully get a better outcome that way. But
Yeah.
I feel like you and we can probably talk about this stuff till we're blue in the face. I know we
Stand on our
covered a little,
podium.
yeah, I know we covered a little bit on the nutritional side and the animal flow and quadrupedal movement side. Is there anything we missed as we were chatting today, Jeff, or anything else that you wanted to
Yeah,
catch people up about?
we did some neat. We have another neat paper in review. If we can stay on the like nutrition side, I'll just tiptoe into this, but it was looking at essentially what's happening at rest when we consume ketone supplements. So really, really neat paper. Again, it's in the review process, so I don't want to talk too much about it, really until it comes out there. But what I will say is again, these ketone esters continue to show to be very potent at raising blood ketone levels. They still tend to taste like rocket fuel, but I believe they're getting better, and there's some products out there that are addressing the taste issues. What was really neat, what we found in this study, was the power of the ketone salts, and specifically this R beta hydroxybutyrate. And so this specific type, and I'll kind of leave it at that. I'm not totally prepared to go into too more details myself on it, but some really neat where this specific combination of ketone salts, or this molecule, I shouldn't say a combination, it's actually a molecule that we used for this study, was neat in that not only did it increase your blood ketone levels and get us into a state of exogenous ketosis, but it also buffered the acid load that is pretty typical with the monoester. So usually when you ingest a monoester, blood ketones go through the roof quickly in 30 to 60 minutes, but you get this huge acid load, which can affect performance if we're staying on the performance side, right? If you have too much of that acid floating around your body, the body's got to deal with it, and it can impact performance. Whereas this salt, we saw a buffering of that acid load, but with the same blood ketone raising effects. So interesting. I did want to pop out one more cool study that we did. So the last one, this is really neat. We were inspired by Dr. Craig Heller's work, but he's done a lot of work with palm cooling and glabrous skin, and kind of challenged the way we cool ourselves. Oftentimes we think towel around the head, towel around the neck. He's found that their glabrous skin being the surfaces of your body that are hairless, they are amazing for heat transference. So we looked at a device that is out there, a commercial device that's made by a guy named Kyle Sela. He founded this company called Ava Cooling, Palm Cooling, and it's a baton made of some special metal that it's a metallic hollowed out baton. You can fill with cold water, and man, it keeps that water really, really cold. And the metal surface that it's made out of conducts heat. It receives the heat from your hands, and it also transfers the heat from the cold from the cold water that's in there, efficiently. So we looked at this cool palm cooling device. It's a neat device that we said, man, this has some application, right? We can give this to athletes, stick it in a cooler, and at halftime, give it to a soccer team, and they can hopefully maybe lower their core temperature. So sadly, we could not measure core temperature for this study, but what we did was we measured repeat sprint ability following a fatiguing protocol. And so we had about 20 athletes. These were female athletes, and they performed 75-minute fatiguing protocol, repeat jog, sprints, and runs. And then immediately following that fatiguing protocol, which does suck. If anyone's really interested, you could look at it. It's called the LIST protocol. It's a great workout, but it sucks. You're fatigued. We allowed the athletes to either palm cool for 3 minutes with this device, or to just sit at rest with no cooling. And then they performed 20-meter repeat sprints. And they did as many as they could at what we calculated as 90, I think it was 90 or 95% of their top speed. So by the time, if they had done 2 consecutive sprints that were below their 90% cutoff, the testing was terminated, and we calculated how many successful sprints they did. And we found an amazing benefit with palm cooling, that palm cooling subjects were able to complete significantly more repeat sprints than those who did not palm cool after fatigue. So it has some neat implications from maybe a game management, a practice management, right? There's still a lot more for us to look into with that palm cooling effect, but it was a neat study, very well done. Again, I wish we could have measured core body temp to round that out, but there was a lot of other neat controls that were done throughout that study there. So
yeah, no,
thanks for letting me get that one in.
For sure. That's fascinating stuff. And that's why we continue to do these kind of talks, Jeff, every year. Is you guys are always doing great work and looking where others are not. And I'm not even familiar with the concept of palm cooling until you just brought it up. So I am excited to dive into those things a little bit more. And I'm excited to kind of see where you all are at in your work next year. For people who are listening to reach out to you, I feel like you probably got all the information right on the Grove City College website, correct?
Correct. Yep. Yeah. Unfortunately, I'm kind of low key. I don't do too much on the social media, but you can find phone number and email address on Grove City's website.
Yep, you're
Love
more
to.
the MySpace generation, I know.
Yes. But no,
So
happy to field any questions or comments or ideas for future research if anyone wants to throw them our way.
collaborate
Yes, yes, we love collaboration.
for sure. We will link to all that in the description below. That way, if you didn't quite catch it, you can just click there. Jeff, it's always a pleasure, man. I really appreciate your time.
Same. Thanks, Dan. All the best to you, buddy.